Hi, and welcome back to another segment of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all the time. Puddles and I have traveled to Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, to be with our good friend Bob Raa. Bob, so good to see you.
Good to see you, Mike.
Bob and I met, gee whiz, 20 years ago now.
At least.
20 years ago, at least, when I was a member of the Hilton Head Orchestra, and Bob was also likewise in the second trombonist of the Hilton Head Orchestra. And Bob is in addition to studying with Mr. Jacobs for a certain amount of time, in his youth he was also a member of the trombone section of the Chicago Symphony during the 1950s. So I was always attracted to all of the stories and information and all that sort of thing. So I'm so glad that finally I get to interview you, not only for this project for Tuba People TV, but just for all those CSO memories as well.
Well, you're always looking for an opportunity to get out of the snows of Oregon to get down here where it's nice and warm. So
just rub it in. Puddle says, "Yeah, that's right. That's pretty." He's actually enjoying the Hilton Head Ducks. You know, the other webbed foot people down there.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, I'm wondering, just from there's several segments I wanted to cover in this time with you. Maybe we just start with your background, trombone, euphonium, baritone. You were going to school at Farragut High School in Chicago.
I went to Farragut High School in Chicago and then went on to the University of Chicago for 2 years. And while at the University of Chicago, I was also played in the Civic Orchestra and subbed with the Chicago Symphony at that time. The Korean War came along, and with a very high draft number, I decided to find a way to take advantage of some of my musical background and became a member of the United States Military Academy Band at West Point.
Okay.
And was there for 4 years until I left, and was fortunate enough to go right from West Point into the Chicago Symphony Orchestra.
So that would have been, I think you remember you were in the CSO from 1954 to 1959?
That's correct.
And I remember in you describing early on in our friendship, when I found out that you'd studied with Jake, you said that your cousin Jerry Saruchek had recommended that you study with Mr. Jacobs.
That's correct. Jerry was the second oboe of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and he was kind of a mentor to me. And when he made that suggestion, I called Jake, who I call Coach, and started taking lessons with him. And it was very interesting because up to that point, studying the trombone and the baritone, you were emphasizing primarily the techniques of the instrument and how far you could stretch that. And with the coach, it was entirely different. He emphasized the sound and the playing in an orchestra more than anything else, and the singing of an etude. He made me sing an etude before he actually let me play it on the instrument. So it was a very, very interesting approach. And it was something that carried into my orchestra playing.
So the notion of singing the etude before you played it in your lesson, this was different than the lessons experience that you'd had from other teachers.
That's correct. That's correct.
So you would come to the lesson fully prepared to sing your etude before you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's when we got into phrasing, and we got into breath control and so forth, and so many aspects of playing an instrument that you have to experience as a voice also.
What was the period of study, the years of time with Jacobs?
The time, probably 3.5 years total. 1947 through 50 when I went to West Point, and then at Jake's suggestion, he contacted Neil DiBiase and arranged for me to have lessons with him. Neil DiBiase was then the principal trombone of the NBC Orchestra in New York with Toscanini. And there, that part of my playing took on more of an aspect of the techniques of the instrument. The sound was really established by Jake.
Can you describe what a typical lesson was like? You'd show up
Well,
at his house.
I would.
Did you drive down there to his house?
No, I would take the streetcar from. I lived on the 3200 South Kedvale Avenue in Chicago, and not having a car or access to a car, and I was too young really to drive. I would take the streetcar down to his house on a Sunday morning, and usually get him out of bed. And his wife Gazella was there, and she would fix us coffee and a roll or something. And then while Jake was getting ready, I would probably mow the lawn or wash his car or do some of things around the house that he was totally inept at.
Wasn't mechanically inclined.
He was not at all mechanically inclined, but I would take care of a lot of those things. Then we'd play for a while, and we'd have some lunch, and then I'd go and do something else, and then come back and play. So I ended up staying at his house almost the entire day on Sundays.
Wow. Those were long lessons.
Those were long lessons, but I was his first trombone student. And I think he only at that point had maybe two, maybe three tuba students at the time. One was Harold McDonald, who ended up in the Pittsburgh Orchestra, Clyde Bashand, who was also in the Pittsburgh Orchestra, and Walton.
Paul Walton.
Paul Walton ended up in the Minneapolis Orchestra.
Okay, that's great. Bob, if you studied with Jake, say 47 to 50, that was prior to him going into the UC Medical School with Herseth and Lambert and Phil Farkas and himself and doing all those experiments. So it must have been non-academic and non-medicine lingo and that sort of thing.
Well, I was probably someone that he was experimenting on some of these things with before he even got into the expansion into the various aspects that he followed up later on in his teaching.
Do you recall him talking about cause and effect or psychology or any physiological or medical terms or intercostal muscles or?
No, not at all. None whatsoever.
So it was really just strictly musical and just making sure that you had enough air to have a great sound. And as you mentioned, sound was king.
Sound with him, that was the king.
What do you suppose? Having studied with him a bit and playing with him in the CSO, you got to hear him quite a bit. What do you think got him to have such a tremendously resonant sound?
I think it was his emphasis with his voice. He had a very stentorian voice, and he tried to emulate that in his playing, and then he passed it on to me, and then expanded that as future students came along.
So it was an imitation. His tuba sound was an outgrowth of maybe his vocal concept.
Yes, and he had a very good voice.
Yeah.
He had a very good voice, and
I remember him saying that he did some radio work, radio announcing, and
yes.
even did, I think, some paid singing in a church in Philadelphia. So
I'm sure of that. First time I saw Arnold Jacobs, I was still quite a youngster, and my mother took me to have lunch at the Walnut Room at the Marshall Fields in Chicago. And lo and behold, they had a trio playing there. And this was about the time that he entered the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, because he had been in the Pittsburgh Orchestra and came to Chicago without a job at the time, but played jobs with his string bass before that. And then eventually ended up in the Chicago Orchestra. And started to expand a lot of his thinking about with the voice and about the sound and so forth.
Mm-hmm. That would have been 1944, I think, is when he came.
That's when he came in the Chicago Orchestra.
And so you saw him in with a jazz trio, just playing string bass.
Yeah, and jazz in those days was not what jazz is today. It was very conservative jazz at the time.
Right. Yeah. Now, Bob, when he was in the CSO, that was from 1954 to 1959. You were assistant principal trombone, but I know later in the decade you ended up playing quite a bit of just straight principal.
Yes, I ended up playing straight principal a good part of the last times I was in the orchestra. And then after that, when I left the music business, I went into aviation, where I became a pilot while I was at West Point, and found that my ability to earn a living was, in those early years of the Chicago Orchestra, was rather commanding.
I remember in some of our early meetings, just talks before, after, during breaks and rehearsals with the Hilton Head Orchestra. You made the statement that, well, you know, the CSO job back in those days was a crummy job, and that was, of course, my ears pricked up to that, because what? The Chicago Symphony was a crummy job? Please elaborate. So yeah.
The big music jobs in Chicago at that time were with the WGN radio and NBC radio and the Chicago Theater. The Chicago Theater had a small but orchestra in the pit for every performance, and those were the good jobs. And if you played in the orchestra, I remember coming to Chicago. I think my salary at that time was $155 a week, and
it was 28 weeks.
28-week season we only had, and if you played Ravinia, you had to play at half scale. So it was
4 weeks at Ravinia at half pay.
Yeah, yeah. It was a hard way to make a living at that time. And when I saw opportunities in aviation where I could triple my salary almost overnight, that's when I decided to do that.
I remember you telling me that pretty much all what we would call the stars, the legendary figures of the CSO back then and during the 50s with Reiner, they had to take outside jobs, not music jobs necessarily, but civilian jobs, if I can use that term.
Well, some of us, a few of us, flew in the Air National Guard then out of Orchard Field, Orchard Air Force Base, which eventually became O'Hare Airport.
Right.
Some, like Bud Herseth, sold used cars. Some, like Janis Starker, the world famous cellist,
Yeah.
Sold men's clothing at Marshall Fields, and on and on. Milton Preves, the principal violist, started an insurance business, which he had throughout his career in the orchestra.
Wow.
And so everyone had to find something else to do in order to survive.
Yeah. Must have been, that was very difficult in terms of making a living, but the upside must have been just the tremendous musical achievements.
That's why those of us that were in the orchestra wanted to be part of that orchestra, because of the sound of that orchestra. And the music that we made with Reiner and some of the great guest conductors that came in. I'll never forget when Von Bainham came from Europe as a guest conductor. He started, I'll never forget, the Brahms Second Symphony. And no sooner did he get started, he just sat down and listened to the orchestra. And when the first movement was over, he said, "Gentlemen, you know this as well as I do. This is all, I just would like you to do this and this and this," and that was the end of it. He didn't rant or rave about anything. So it was quite an experience with all of those, with Ormandy that came, with Bernstein that came, and I'm just trying to recall some of the big conductors that came, but
Yeah, well, and of course, Dr. Reiner.
and Dr. Reiner, who was we used to call him Dr. Warmth.
Bob, you mentioned Dr. Reiner, Dr. Warmth. I'm wondering, what was your audition process like? I know it was somewhat different
Well, I was
those days.
as I said, I was studying with Neil DiBiase from the NBC Orchestra, and I came to a lesson one time, and he told me that there's going to be an opening in the Chicago trombone section. And so I called at that time George Kuiper, who was the manager, and who I knew from my days in the Civic Orchestra, who was not in the office, but I talked to Fran Baker, who was his secretary. Explained to her that I wanted to talk to George about an audition. And she said, well, he's not here. He's on his way to New York, but he'll be checking into the Barbizon Plaza Hotel later on this afternoon. So being at West Point, I got one of my friends, Dave Zauter, who went on to the Cleveland Orchestra, drove me down, and I sat in the lobby of the Barbizon Plaza until George Kuiper walked in the door, and reintroduced myself to him, and he remembered me, and told him that I was playing in the National Orchestra Association in New York while studying with Neil DiBiase. And he said, well, all right, we're going to be holding auditions at Steinway Hall next Tuesday. Can you be there? I said, absolutely. So I went, again, Dave Zauter drove me down to the audition, and I went in both with the trombone and with my baritone. And from studying with Neil DiBiase, who knew the types of things that Reiner would be asking for, we prepared those things, both on trombone and on baritone. And there were 14 of us there. Now the audition procedure is entirely different than it is now, where you have to post auditions. Auditions there were really arranged by a conductor going to people that he knew in the industry and wanted their recommendations on someone he should hear.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was lucky enough through George Kuiper to be recommended for him to hear me, and I think there were 14 of us there for that audition. And when all was said and done, after the culling out and so forth, George came up to me and said, good thing you caught me at the Barbizon Plaza, I'll be sending you a contract. So I left West Point. I was discharged on October 1st, 1954, and I started with the Chicago Symphony on October 6th, 1954.
Wow. Do you remember your the first concert as a member?
Yes, I do. We did the Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony. I'll never forget that.
That's great.
That was I forget we did a Berlioz overture, and I don't know what else was on the program, but I remember that, especially the ending of the Organ Symphony.
That's some big brass.
Yes.
A lot of long tubes from
Yeah.
the organ and from the orchestra.
Yeah.
At Puddles, he said organ, not Oregon. Oregon, not Oregon. Do you have any memorable stories about Dr. Reiner?
Well, personally, I would say my greatest success was, I remember playing when I was asked to come in at the last second to play first, when I was still assistant, the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, and the entrance there, and which was difficult. Came off very well, and not only did Reiner throw me a bow, but more important to me than anything else was Bud Herseth turned around and gave me a big compliment. So,
wow.
That, and the other thing was that I remember with when we did Don Quixote, which was the opening of my second year in the orchestra, and I was playing the baritone part, and which is a big part. And when it was all said and done, after when the concert was when we finished the program, Reiner had me come up along with Janus Starker and bow with him at the podium. So those were very memorable times for me.
And you also are the tenor tubist on the Beatles solo
Yes.
on that Fritz Reiner recording.
Yes.
That's a wonderful performance.
So, yeah, those were great days.
Yeah. But obviously, you had other fish to fry in your career, and so decided to leave in '59.
I had two careers. I had one career in music, and I had one career in aviation.
Right.
Aviation has been a great career where I've had my own companies, and now I'm one of the partners of an operation in Houston, Texas, where we do all of the servicing for NASA,
Mm-hmm.
and that's proved to be a very, very good business.
That's great. As of today, this taping, I'm struck that really from the low brass section during that 1950s time, it's you and Mr. Kleinhammer who remain, and it's amazing.
Well, it's I'm fortunate in I was the youngest one in the orchestra at the time, so Ed and I still converse from time to time, but Ed is now well into his 90s, and I'm not quite there yet. But
You're looking great, by the way.
well, I'm blessed with very good health,
Yeah.
and I've been blessed all through my life with good things that have happened, and it was the early years were hard, but things worked out very well.
Now, during the 50s, seems like there was something that took place that changed. That seemed like it fractured the orchestra. Maybe, I don't know if it was the whole orchestra or parts of the orchestra, but there was something that went on in the 50s and maybe the early 60s, just after you'd left. Because I remember you would often say that when you were in the orchestra, everybody got on great. You played cards all the time, and you come back for visits, and all of a sudden people weren't talking to each other. But over lunch today, you mentioned that maybe some of those seeds had been sowed during the latter part of your tenure there.
I think the biggest factor that occurred was the change from a 28-week season to a 52-week season, and the improvement in the economics for a musician in the orchestra. When I was there, it was a very hard life, but things changed, and they didn't change easily. They changed with a lot of animosity between players and between management, and it was those were very difficult times. The playing was as good as ever, but the esprit between the musicians was not what it used to be. I go back. I'm a member of the Alumni Association of the orchestra,
Mm-hmm.
and I go back now, and it's come back a great deal from what it was. But I understand after I left, things were really difficult there for the musicians for several years.
Yeah, I mean, there's examples of musicians sitting side by side and not talking to each other all season or for several years.
For several years, they didn't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And it was not a good and not a happy situation to play in. In my time, when I was there, everyone was pulling for the other guy. I guess it wasn't that way after that.
Maybe was everybody more or less in the same boat? And
Everyone was in the same boat. No one was a favorite of Reiner by any means. He had no favorites. Everyone had their turn in the tank with him, and
everybody was tested.
Oh, you were always tested, and it could have been a minute rehearsal, and you were being tested.
Wow. And you had mentioned getting a compliment from Mr. Herseth. That must have been a thrill. What was that like playing next to Bud?
It was Bud Herseth set the tone of the brass section of that orchestra. Everyone tried to match him, and in that process, we played together better than any time I've ever remembered in an orchestra. Because you're trying to bring yourself up to the level of Bud Herseth. Not that Bud Herseth or Arnold Jacobs or Phil Farkas, I've heard stories where they never missed. Everyone had their chance at missing and did on occasion. But the tone of that brass section was really set by Bud Herseth.
It seemed like it was in those days it was a very electric tone, electric sound, and I mean, some would even say it was over the top. And I had heard stories, and then when I got into civic, playing in the orchestra hall, it seemed like there was an acoustical issue with the podium being in somewhat of a dead spot. I'm wondering, did you happen to notice any? Were the conductors just asking for more? It just got so loud.
Yeah, the conductors were, because they didn't hear. A lot of the sound in orchestra hall went up.
Yeah.
Instead of out at the conductor.
So it's just the design of that oyster shell.
Yes, exactly.
Background. Yeah. And did you happen to notice any pre-concert rituals with yourself or Bud or Jake or Farkas or any of your colleagues in terms of preparation for a concert?
Well, we all practiced. We all had to practice to live up to the standards that we were expected of. And we were always there at least an hour beforehand, sitting down, acclimating ourselves to the environment,
Mm-hmm.
playing the usual long tones and scales and so forth to get used to whatever we were going to be playing.
Yeah. Were you ever worried that Dr. Reiner would be listening to your preparation, your warm up?
Yeah, he would do that. He would always come in from Michigan Avenue through the front door, where the orchestra would come in from the back door. And you would see him every once in a while come in at the back where there were no lights on, and listening to some of the players warming up and seeing how they practiced their parts.
Knowing that, then, do you think that people had this idea of, even though it's a warm up, they're actually performing? So they have this they're going through a warm up, but it's more of a concert warm up, prepare warm up.
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
With Dr. Reiner, now he put everybody in the barrel from time to time, and Herseth always told the story of Zarathustra, and Jacobs would tell stories about Meistersinger. Do you remember anything about yourself when he was testing you, or had maybe there was a particular solo or anything, maybe a chord that he wanted to make sure was in tune, or anything of that nature? Where
no, if he was testing you, for instance, in the Beethoven Fifth, I'll never forget, where the trombones come in at the first trombone at the high C.
Yeah.
Somehow he wouldn't single you out, but he would ask the strings that he wanted to start at the beginning again.
Right.
And then again and again, and of course you had to play along with that. And
Right.
he was really listening to you and some of the other people too.
I think that reminds me of Mr. Herseth's story about Zarathustra, how he was messing around with the flutes or with the fiddle part.
That's
and
right.
All around the call part of Zarathustra. Yeah. Well, Bob, I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been to see you again today. Puddles and I drove up from Orlando this morning just to meet with Bob, and thank you again for lunch and all the lunches and countless dinners and the wonderful fellowship that you've provided over the last 20-some years.
Well, you've given a dimension to the Chicago Orchestra that I wasn't familiar with, that era after my time. And as I go back now to the alumni meetings, it's interesting to hear how people relate to the various times that they were in the orchestra. For some of us, for very long times.
Yeah. Well, Puddles, and I would like to present you with this genuine University of Oregon beverage dispenser for use in your home. Or, as I understand, your daughter's a big Ducks fan.
My daughter is a big Ducks fan. Why, I'll never know. She has never been to Oregon. She only sees the Oregon Ducks on television, and that is, for some reason, her most favorite football team. So she will be thrilled with this. I assure you, you'll be welcomed.
Thanks, Bob. And now back to you.